Shut up, am I not allowed to stay at my parents' house? David, my husband, shouted at me angrily the day after our wedding. That morning, I woke up to find David packing clothes into a carry-on bag. He said his parents had called him and he needed to go visit them. David's parents lived close enough for a day trip. The fact that he was packing clothes meant he planned to stay overnight. If something serious was happening that required David to stay at his parents' house, I was worried too. But when I asked him what was going on, David ignored my questions and left without any explanation. 3 days has passed since I tried to tell myself that maybe there was something difficult for him to talk about, and decided to wait patiently for him. Finally, I received a call from David. From that day forward, he did keep in touch, but he still didn't come home. The time I spent waiting alone for him felt excruciatingly long. A week went by, then 2, and David still didn't return. Eventually, 3 whole months passed. Unable to stand it any longer, I decided to visit David's parents' house. What? He hasn't been here at all. Brittany, my mother-in-law, greeted me and told me that David hadn't shown up at their place once during those 3 months. At that moment, Walter, my father-in-law, began to shake. Could it be? Shut up, am I not allowed to stay at my parents' house? David, my husband, shouted at me angrily the day after our wedding. That morning, I woke up to find David packing clothes into a carry-on bag. He said his parents had called him and he needed to go visit them. David's parents lived close enough for a day trip. The fact that he was packing clothes meant he planned to stay overnight. If something serious was happening that required David to stay at his parents' house, I was worried too. But when I asked him what was going on, David ignored my questions and left without any explanation. 3 days has passed since I tried to tell myself that maybe there was something difficult for him to talk about, and decided to wait patiently for him. Finally, I received a call from David. From that day forward, he did keep in touch, but he still didn't come home. The time I spent waiting alone for him felt excruciatingly long. A week went by, then 2, and David still didn't return. Eventually, 3 whole months passed. Unable to stand it any longer, I decided to visit David's parents' house. What? He hasn't been here at all. Brittany, my mother-in-law, greeted me and told me that David hadn't shown up at their place once during those 3 months. At that moment, Walter, my father-in-law, began to shake. Could it be? He tried to explain the situation, but nothing he said clarified where David was or what was going on. With the help of David's parents, I started looking into what he had been doing during those 3 months and eventually confronted him. I know everything now. Is there anything you want to say in your defense? I am Ashley, 42 years old, and I recently got engaged. My fiancé is David, my 43-year-old boss at work. David had been my mentor when I was a new hire, and we've known each other for over 20 years. But knowing each other didn't mean we'd been dating that whole time. It was a long-standing professional relationship between a boss and his subordinate. We were both passionate about our work, often debating work-related matters. At office parties, people would joke, "You two should just date already. This makes no sense. Why aren't you two dating?" Our coworkers would often tease us, seeing how well David and I got along. But I had never thought of him that way. Back then, I was in a relationship with someone I had been dating since college, so I wasn't interested in anyone else. But when I turned 30 and started thinking about marriage, he broke up with me in the cruelest way. Of course, I'd rather be with a young new hire rather than a 30-year-old woman who only prioritizes work. He had been cheating on me with a woman who had joined his company. Sure, There had been times when I canceled dates at the last minute because of work issues. There were also moments when I had to turn down his invitations, saying it was impossible because of busy work periods. But wasn't he the same? In fact, over the past few months, he had been the one frequently canceling plans. Those cancellations, I realized, were probably so he could see her. The thought of it made me feel bitter, pathetic, and deeply sad. Wounded, I swore to never fall in love again or dream about marriage. I decided to focus on building a stable future, dedicating myself to work more than ever. Years passed, and David was promoted to manager while I became a section chief. The company buzzed with excitement at the news of the first female section chief. The company had always been traditional, with women rarely rising above the position of team lead. The new company president initiated organizational changes, leading to my historic promotion. On the day it was announced, David and I decided to celebrate our promotions with dinner. At that dinner, David asked me out. It wasn't a romantic declaration. It felt more like a formal proposal. Hesitant and still scarred from my past, I initially turned him down. But when David explained that he wanted a relationship built on mutual respect, not just passion, I reconsidered and decided to give it a chance. 7 years went by. We dated steadily, and on my 42nd birthday, David proposed. True to his style, it was practical. We're not getting any younger. Don't you think it's time we got married? There was no diamond ring at a fancy restaurant. Just the two of us at our usual tapas bar. Casual as ever, but I didn't care about that. What mattered to me was the hope of a peaceful, stable life, even without a grand romantic proposal. With David, I believed that kind of life was possible. So I said yes. We shared the news at work, and I submitted my resignation at the same time. Office relationships weren't prohibited, but we would be working in the same department as a married couple, and with both of us holding positions of authority, it was inevitable that it would create an awkward dynamic for our subordinates. After discussing it, David and I agreed that it made sense for me, the one with the lower title, to leave to avoid any potential conflicts. David, who was expected to become the department head one day, would continue leading the team. As for me, I wasn't one to stay idle as a housewife, so once things settled down, I planned to look for a new job. With that, I started a transition process at work and began preparing for the wedding. The first step was visiting my parents, who lived far away, to share the news. We planned it as a mini vacation. My parents, who had seen me go through heartbreak after my ex-boyfriend left, had never pressured me about marriage, but had quietly hoped for it. When they heard the news, they cried tears of joy and said, "Take good care of Ashley. Ashley's been through so much. Make sure you cherish her." William and Jessica, my parents, asked David to take care of me. Next, it was time to visit David's parents and share the news. David's parents' house wasn't far from where we worked. We planned a day trip over the weekend, but I was incredibly nervous. Would they accept him marrying me, a woman in her 40s? What if they were hoping for grandchildren and opposed the marriage? Could they possibly be unkind or disapproving? The mix of emotions made me feel almost sick, but when we arrived, David's parents welcomed me warmly. "If you ever have any problems, don't hesitate to come to us, okay? If David does anything out of line, you tell me, and I'll make sure he regrets it," they joked, making me feel at ease. I felt reassured that a man raised by such kind-hearted people would make for a joyful, supportive husband. After our family meeting went smoothly, we began preparing for the wedding. I suggested we could skip the ceremony due to my age, but David said, "This is a first marriage for both of us, and I bet your parents would love to see a wedding, even if it's small. They'll be happy." Showing my parents, who were overjoyed to the point of tears when we announced our engagement, that I was happy wasn't a bad idea. David's parents, too, would certainly want to see their son looking content and fulfilled. If making everyone happy meant putting up with a bit of embarrassment, then it was a small price to pay. And so, I spent my days leading up to my resignation in a whirlwind of wedding preparations and handing over my work responsibilities. In between, we found a new place to live. And before I knew it, my last day at work had arrived. My colleagues presented me with a bouquet, and I completed my final tests amid warm congratulations. There was a touch of sadness, but I felt ready to start my new life as David's wife, supporting our household. That feeling probably came from knowing that we'd start living together from the next day. We hadn't had our wedding yet. The reason wasn't something romantic, like wanting the wedding on an anniversary or a special birthday. What I was concerned about was the inconvenience it would cause my workplace. Leaving was already going to disrupt things enough, and I felt guilty about making them handle additional paperwork for my marriage when they knew I was about to leave. Getting married before resigning would mean even more administrative work for the company. They'd have to process those changes, only to then handle my resignation right afterward. So I figured if we got married after I left, they'd only need to deal with my departure paperwork. David and I discussed it and decided we'd have the wedding after I resigned. It was a practical decision, very typical of us. After leaving my job, I had more time to devote to wedding preparations, but progress was slow. That was because, not long after we got married, David stopped helping with the planning altogether. I understood that he was busy training the person who replaced me at work. Still, there were things I couldn't handle alone, especially when it came to his friends and relatives, who I barely knew. Even so, David's response was always the same. "Yay, sure. I trust you to handle everything, Ashley." Before retreating to his study, even when it came to things like wedding favors or venue decorations, he would say, "I trust your taste," and leave it at that. While I knew he was busy, I wished he'd at least offer an opinion. Yet, knowing my resignation had added to his workload made me hesitate to push him. So I pressed on, planning the wedding with help from my in-laws and advice from the planner, and managed to pull it together. However, even on the wedding day, David seemed distracted. He'd drift into a daze or glance nervously around. Even when guests offered congratulations, his responses were brief and hollow, his face blank. I felt guilty for the guests who had come to celebrate, worried they'd notice. "Is something wrong? Are you worried about something?" But David didn't answer, leaving a shadow over what should have been a joyous occasion. His parents noticed his behavior too. "What's going on with you? You're being disrespectful to Ashley, her parents, and all our guests." They scolded him, but it made no difference. That night, even after we got home, David shut himself in his room, leaving me feeling unsettled as I drifted into an uneasy sleep. The next morning, I woke to see David packing clothes into a carry-on bag. We weren't planning a honeymoon, nor did he have any upcoming business trips. So why was he packing clothes? When I asked, he said his parents had told him to come visit. "You're packing so much just to visit. It's not even that far." "Shut up. Am I not allowed to stay at my parents' house?" "I didn't say you couldn't. It was just a question." But his sudden outburst escalated the situation. Packing that much meant he intended to stay over. If something serious enough for David to stay overnight at his parents' house was happening, of course, I would be worried. When I tried to ask what was going on, David abruptly shut his carry-on bag and snapped, "Stay out of family matters." before storming out. His words hurt me deeply. Weren't his parents my family now too, even if only by marriage? Wasn't David, my husband, part of my family? I felt tears well up. Still, I told myself that maybe there was something he found difficult to discuss, and decided to wait for him. But even after 3 days, David neither returned or contacted me. Worried, I called him, but he didn't answer. I tried again several times with pauses in between, but still, there was no response. I thought about calling his parents' house when he finally called back. Why can't you get it through your head? If I'm not answering, there's probably a reason for it. His sudden anger made me feel frustrated. Maybe I had been persistent, but it was only because I was worried. It wasn't like David had asked me to care. But wasn't it normal to give a simple update if you didn't want others worrying? When I pointed this out, David started apologizing. I'm sorry. I've been stressed out and worried about Mom's health. Brittany, she's unwell. At the wedding, she had shown no signs of being ill. Could she have fallen sick right after? I offered to go and help at his parents' house, but David declined. Even though it was a weekend, David would need to go back to work the next day. I thought it made sense for me to step in since I had already left my job. But David said, "She's my mom, so I'll handle it. Just stay home, Ashley," before hanging up. After that, David started updating me with messages and calls, perhaps to keep me from worrying. But Brittany's condition didn't seem to improve. Even after visiting a major hospital, there was no clear diagnosis. I was beside myself with worry, but David would say, "She'd feel pressured if you came by, Ashley," so all I could do was hope for a recovery from home. A week turned into 2, and David still didn't come home. The time I spent waiting alone felt painfully long. Before the wedding, living alone with a full-time job made time pass quickly. Now, after finishing the cleaning and laundry, there was nothing else to do. By then, I was already beginning to regret getting married. I had hoped for a peaceful, stable home life, but now I wasn't even sure if I had a home at all. David was staying at his parents' house, while I, his wife, stayed home without a job, feeling idle. Could this even be called a marriage? Days of doubt passed until 3 months had gone by, and David still hadn't come back. His calls and messages became increasingly infrequent. Could Brittany really be unwell for 3 whole months? And how was David managing work while supposedly caring for her? Why hadn't Walter, his father, said anything about David not coming home? Determined to find answers and check on Brittany, I decided to visit his parents' house. Just as I reached for the doorbell, Brittany stepped out, dressed casually in a tracksuit. "Oh, Ashley, what a nice surprise. Are you visiting?" She greeted me with a cheerful voice and a smile. "I heard you weren't feeling well." "What? No, I'm perfectly fine. I was just about to go for a walk," she said, looking puzzled as I stood there, stunned. She invited me inside, and I followed, still processing. Walter, who was retired, was also at home. "Why did you look so surprised earlier?" Brittany asked as she set a cup of coffee in front of me and sat beside Walter. "Well," I explained that David hadn't returned since the day after our wedding, and that he told me he was staying at their house. "What? He hasn't been here at all?" It turned out David hadn't visited once since the wedding. So his story about staying at his parents' house to care for Brittany had been a lie. I sighed, managing only a quiet, "I see." So where was David staying? I could guess, but I desperately hoped I was wrong. Beside Brittany, who looked troubled, Walter's face turned pale, and he started trembling. Could it be? It seemed Walter knew something. Brittany, looking anxious, urged him, "If you know something, tell us now." Walter hesitated for a moment before speaking. It's just a possibility. But I need to say this, Walter prefaced cautiously, and said David might be having an affair. Walter explained that he had recently seen David walking in town with a young woman. At first, he thought he'd mistaken the woman for someone else since she was smaller than me. But after hearing that David hadn't been coming home, he realized it might not have been a mistake. Brittany's face turned pale as she apologized to me, though it wasn't her fault, and we still weren't sure of the truth. Walter asked me what I wanted to do next. Although I was in shock and hadn't considered my next steps, being asked directly helped clarify my feelings. I want to know the truth. If David was truly cheating, I wanted a divorce, and for him to face the consequences, even if he wasn't. If he had lied and stayed away for any reason that made a genuine relationship impossible, it would lead to the same outcome. Divorcing without having lived as a family seemed strange, but living alone while being married made no sense either. I understand. I'm disappointed that this is happening, but I support you, Ashley, Brittany said, understanding my decision. Walter, on the other hand, shouted, if he's been cheating, I'll make sure he regrets it. When I returned home, I immediately researched private investigators and hired one for a behavioral investigation on David. I opted for a general investigation rather than one focused solely on infidelity, just in case there was another explanation. As it turned out, there was no need for such caution. A week later, I received the report from the agency. They had started following David after he left work. The report included photos of David walking hand in hand with a woman at a park near the office. They got on a bus and exited near David's parents' home before entering an apartment together. The mailbox outside the apartment had both their names on it, which was clear proof they were living together. The next day, they left the apartment together, hand in hand, and parted ways at a coffee shop near the office, David heading to work, and the woman staying for coffee. The investigation also revealed that the woman was the person who had been hired to replace me when I left. She was 30 years old, a full decade younger than me, and highly qualified. The timeline matched perfectly with when David began acting distant. When he said he was busy training a new employee, it wasn't entirely false. But it wasn't training for work, it was training his affair partner. Holding the investigation report I had received from the private investigator, I headed to David's parents' house. During my last visit, I had promised to share the findings once I had them. Walter read the report, his face turning red with fury. Brittany, tears streaming down her face, apologized to me and vowed to help in any way she could. I thanked them for their support and asked them to keep my presence a secret while they called David over, since Brittany's tearful voice might tip him off. Walter made the call instead. He invited David by saying he had a lot of David's favorite pastries from a friend and asked him to come pick them up. Of course, there were no pastries, but David would likely show up quickly. After all, the apartment where David was now living was located between his parents' house and the condominium where I lived. Sure enough, David arrived in under 30 minutes. He walked into the living room, looking pleased, but froze when he saw me there. Ashley, what are you doing here? Seeing me at his parents' house meant David's lies were out in the open. He turned pale and tried to flee, but Brittany blocked the doorway, preventing his escape. Walter glared at David, making sure he stayed put. Brittany sat beside me and, with biting sarcasm, said, "It seems my health hasn't improved at all. When do you think I'll get better?" Pointing out his lies. David shrank under the gaze of his parents, unable to come up with any excuses. Even if I were in his shoes, I couldn't think of any explanation that would make sense. And for David, caught off guard by the sudden exposure of his lies, it was even less likely. I know everything now. Do you have anything to say for yourself? David tried to defend himself, saying that as the wedding approached, he became afraid of married life. Despite my claim of knowing everything, he was still trying to hide the affair. David explained that while living alone before moving into our new home, he had thought he could manage living with me since we had spent so much time together at work. But after we started living together, he realized he wasn't suited for cohabitation. Did he think this excuse would lead to an amicable divorce? There was no way I'd allow that. Cohabitation. You seem fine living with a young woman, don't you? David and I had lived together for less than 2 months, but he had already been living with his mistress for 3. I lay the evidence photos from the private investigator in front of David. His face turned pale as he began to panic. The photos clearly showed both David and his lover. You had me investigated. Your behavior was too suspicious to ignore. If David had come home even half the time, I might never have gone to his parents' house and uncovered his lies. But he hadn't come home for 3 whole months. Anyone would find that strange. It was baffling that David thought he could hide it. He was now angry, accusing me of violating his privacy. But the investigation had been conducted legally, so there was no wrongdoing. Besides, if David hadn't been unfaithful, there would have been no reason for an investigation. Fine. If you know, then you know, he snapped, taking an unapologetic stance. Walter shouted at him, but David retorted, "Of course, any man would prefer a younger woman. My girlfriend is only 30. Who wouldn't be jealous? Don't you dare. Do you even understand what you've done?" Even with his parents scolding him, David remained unfazed. Enough already. I don't need someone like Ashley who's past her prime. I had reached my limit. No, I'm the one who doesn't need you. I won't tolerate being with someone who cheats and shows no remorse. I want a divorce. I handed him the divorce papers, and David signed them eagerly, almost smiling. "And just so you know, you'll be paying alimony." Our marriage had been brief, but I had quit my job for it. On top of that, I hadn't received any financial support during the marriage, so I was entitled to some compensation. "You're really that money hungry? You've saved a lot, haven't you? Can't you let it go? Enough. What's wrong with you and that attitude?" Walter interrupted David's complaints about paying alimony, shouting, "I'm disappointed that you can't even show remorse." Brittany's face was full of anger and disappointment as she scolded her son. "What is this, both of you turning on me? I'm your only son. If you cut ties with me, you'll be the ones struggling in your old age." David's confident demeanor seemed to come from his belief that his parents would never abandon him. However, ever since my previous visit, his parents had been discussing what they would do if it turned out David was cheating. They had considered the possibility of him showing remorse, and the possibility that he wouldn't. It all depended on his attitude. David showed no signs of regret, so Walter declared, "We're cutting ties with you. Don't come back to this house. You'll get nothing from us, not even an inheritance." Brittany wept openly, heartbroken by her son's behavior. Despite seeing his mother's tears, David scoffed, "Fine. If it means being with her, then cut me off." He agreed to pay alimony and sever ties with his parents before walking out. David, who had started dating me knowing how deeply I had been hurt by my ex's affair with a younger woman, now did the same thing to me. There was no way I could forgive him easily. I told his parents that, aside from alimony, I intended to seek further consequences for David, and they gave me their blessing. Later on, I had my lawyer contact David about the alimony. Though he initially resisted, saying it was too high, He ultimately signed the agreement after some persuasion. With this signed agreement in hand, I went to the courthouse to file the divorce papers. Finally, David and I were no longer tied together. But my plans for retribution weren't over yet. David needed to experience the pain he had inflicted on me, just as my ex had done before him. I rang the doorbell of the apartment, just 10 minutes from his parents' house. David opened the door, visibly shocked to see me, but quickly recovered and barked. "The divorce is finalized, right? You said you'd file the papers once I signed. Leave me alone. I'm the one who called her." David turned to see his lover, Stella, speaking from behind him. The reason I was at the apartment was that Stella had asked me to come. A few days earlier, I had met with Stella through my lawyer. The private investigator's report had revealed that Stella hadn't known David was married. I didn't know much about Stella's personality, but she had taken over my job after I left. She was likely logical, responsible, and meticulous. If my assumptions were correct, there was no way she would forgive David for what he had done. I explained everything to Stella and informed her that my divorce would soon be finalized. Apparently, David had hidden the fact that he was married and suggested to Stella that they keep their relationship secret to avoid being seen as playing favorites. Initially, Stella was devastated to learn that David had lied to her and even apologized to me, feeling guilty for her part. However, her sadness soon turned into anger, and she said, "I won't stand for this. I'm breaking up with him immediately," as she reached for her smartphone. But I stopped her. Stella was also a victim of David's deceit. "Why don't we make him pay together?" I suggested, and Stella agreed. However, coming up with a fitting plan for payback was tricky. Stella could pursue a claim against David for violating her rights and causing emotional harm by hiding his marital status. But that alone wouldn't be enough for her. If anyone at work found out she had been involved with a married man, her reputation would be damaged, even though she had been deceived. Meanwhile, David had engaged in a relationship with someone from the same department. "Oh, by the way," Stella's voice broke my thoughts as she remembered something. "Forgive me for asking, but do you know how much David makes?" Apparently, David had given Stella several expensive gifts. They were well beyond what a manager's salary could afford, and Stella had questioned him about it before. David had claimed he had a lot of savings since he had been single for so long, but he often went out drinking and paid for colleagues and subordinates, so there was no way he had significant savings. A manager's salary certainly wouldn't cover multiple high-end gifts. Once, when he was drunk, he even joked, "What if I told you I got these with company expenses? Would you believe me?" Stella and I exchanged a look, suspicion growing. I quickly contacted my former boss and requested an internal investigation. Stella assisted with the investigation, and the results came in yesterday. And within just a few days, the findings came to light. Stella's efficiency proved her worth. She had called me today so we could confront David together. David was visibly rattled, seeing us together. I followed Stella into the apartment. There I stood, in the home David shared with his lover. And for a moment, the absurdity of it all almost made me laugh. David noticed my slight smirk and, thinking I was mocking him, snapped, "Don't you dare laugh at me, you rejected woman." But Stella silenced him with, "Shut up, you liar." David shrank back. With both of us together, he must have known Stella had found out the truth and couldn't fight back. Stella started by asking him why he had hidden his marriage when he approached her. David confessed that he had fallen for Stella when she first joined and worked so diligently, but he knew that if she found out he was married, she'd never give him a chance, so he kept it secret. At work, no one brought up my marriage to David, so he thought he could keep it hidden. Despite being married within the company, he somehow believed nobody would question him about me. Although I once thought David was competent, I now realized how naive his thinking was. I felt ashamed of my poor judgment. Stella echoed my thoughts as she asked, "What were you going to do when people in the department eventually found out you were married?" David admitted he thought he could divorce me before it became known so he could stay with Stella. Stella let out an exasperated sigh. "Then what? Marry me and hit on the next new hire?" David denied it, but Stella's expression said she believed otherwise. "David says he fell for me when he saw me working hard, but wasn't it the same with Ashley?" Stella suggested that David only admired women while they were immersed in their work, but once he stopped seeing them that way, his interest waned. Thinking back, David's coldness towards me started not only when Stella joined, but also when I left my job. The idea that he lost interest after I stopped working wasn't too far-fetched. David seemed deep in thought, but I didn't care anymore. Saying I should never have quit my job was pointless now. I turned to Stella and gestured for her to continue. Stella, breaking David's trance, declared, "I'll be suing you for damages for violating my rights." David looked up in shock, pleading, "Please, just let me be with you," as he turned to her with desperation. But Stella rejected him, telling David that it was over between them. Reluctantly, David agreed and said he would find a way to gather the compensation for both Stella and me soon. It was finally my turn to speak. "You're the head of the accounting department, right? Did you think using company funds would make it easy?" I hinted at what I knew, and David's face turned pale. "No, it's not like that. I don't know what you're talking about," he stammered, visibly shaken. As it turned out, my former boss and Stella had conducted an internal investigation and discovered that David had indeed been misusing company funds. For someone trusted and seen as a future department head, abusing his position for such fraud might have seemed simple. Evidence had already been found showing that David used company expenses for dates with Stella and to buy her expensive gifts, proof that was impossible for him to deny. David, now pale as a ghost, pleaded with Stella and me, "Please, don't report this to the company. I'll pay back everything I took." Neither Stella or I wanted to be complicit in his embezzlement. We firmly refused, but David, now in tears, begged, "I was wrong. I'll never do anything like this again. Please forgive me." However, I knew that my former boss had already informed the higher-ups about the situation. It was far too late to consider keeping it a secret, even if it weren't already reported. There was no way I would hide his fraud because of his pleas. Accounting is, after all, the final safeguard against misconduct. As David continued to beg, his phone rang. "It's the company." The timing seemed almost perfect, but that was no coincidence. Stella and I had been asked by the company to stall David so he couldn't run. Even though it was Saturday, the upper management and the accounting team, except for David and Stella, were all at work. The accounting team was collecting evidence of David's fraud, while the management held a meeting about his embezzlement. The call likely came after the meeting had concluded. Judging by David's tone on the call, it seemed the company had summoned him for a fact-finding meeting. "It's over." David muttered those words before collapsing to his knees, utterly defeated. To ensure he didn't flee, Stella and I escorted him by taxi to the company. Although we weren't allowed inside due to our personal involvement, we handed him over to the security team outside the building. Afterward, David was formally charged with embezzlement and put on trial. He was likely facing a suspended prison sentence. The company, of course, dismissed him immediately. Finding a new job would be nearly impossible. Even if he managed to find work, he would be burdened with paying damages to both Stella and me, as well as compensating the company for its losses. David's future would be spent working just to pay off his debts. Stella sold all the expensive gifts David had given her and used the money to reimburse the company. Although the company stated that Stella bore no responsibility, she insisted that she shared some of the blame and offered her resignation after repaying the money. Having carried out our shared revenge, Stella and I became close, like sisters, often going out together. Our personalities were so alike that being around her felt natural and comforting. After Stella left, I was asked if I wanted to return to the company, but I declined. Even though David acted on his own, I was the former wife of an embezzler. I couldn't deny that I bore some fault for not noticing what he was doing. Returning to the same workplace was out of the question. We still have a lot to learn in accounting. Yes, we need to grow even more as professionals, Stella replied, echoing my thoughts. David's parents were initially shocked to learn about his embezzlement, but eventually they came to terms with it, seeing it as the actions of their disowned son. They continued to care about me, inviting me out for meals. We each overcame our hardships and started moving forward with our lives.
Looks like you're headed for the great beyond tomorrow, just as planned. I froze when I heard a woman's laugh and voice I didn't recognize. The voice was coming from my husband Nicholas's phone. Right now, he's in the shower. Our 4-year-old daughter Margaret happened to be nearby when his phone rang. She touched it and, not knowing any better, turned on the speaker. The woman, assuming my husband had picked up, kept talking. With this, we'll get the insurance money, and finally, we can be a real couple. I got a bad feeling, a real sense of dread. That's when I discovered the terrible secret plan my husband had been hiding. My name is Sophie. I'm 32 and work in an office. I've been married to Nicholas for 5 years, who is 3 years older than me and a company employee. Together with Margaret, we are a family of 3. Nicholas is a doting father. Margaret adores him and always clings to him. Every time I saw this, it filled me with joy. I always wanted to cherish the time spent as a family, so I'd adjust my work schedule to coincide with Nicholas's days off. We'd go shopping, visit the aquarium, or go to the zoo. Margaret was looking forward to those days as well. However, 3 months ago, things changed. You don't need to match your days off with me anymore. Work's gotten busy. What? But Margaret looks forward to spending time with you. It can't be helped. Nicholas yelled at me and left the house without saying another word. He didn't come back that day. Seeing this sudden change in his normally calm demeanor puzzled me. After that day, he started coming home late due to overtime, and the number of sudden business trips increased. And whenever he came back from those trips, his wedding ring was conspicuously missing. For some reason, he also seemed eager to take a shower right away. One day, Nicholas says to me, "How about we take a day off next week and spend some time together, just the 2 of us?" That's unusual, I thought, but it turns out I'm also off from work that day. Come to think of it, since Margaret was born, Nicholas and I haven't had any alone time. He tells me he's already arranged for Margaret to stay at my in-laws' house, so I happily agree. We could go for a drive to the beach. He suggests, and I can't help but look forward to that day. Then, the day before our date comes around. For some reason, Nicholas takes a shower as soon as he gets home. Normally, he takes his phone with him everywhere, even to the bathroom, but today he left it on the table. While I'm cooking, his phone starts to ring. As I'm drying my hands, Margaret picks up the phone and puts it on speaker. "Everything's set for tomorrow. He'll be out of the picture." A mysterious woman's voice fills the air. Stunned by her words, I keep listening. She seems to think Nicholas picked up and continues talking. With this, the insurance money will be ours, and finally, we can. Who's that, Auntie? A friend of Dad's? Hearing Margaret's voice, the woman hurriedly hangs up. Margaret tilts her head. What was that? Maybe it's a friend of Dad's. Let's tell him. Okay. Margaret runs off towards the bathroom with a smile. I guess she wants to tell her dad as soon as possible. In the meantime, his phone is left on the table. Just as I'm about to snoop through it, I hear the bathroom door open and quickly put the phone back in its place. Margaret informs a freshly showered Nicholas. Dad, your friend called. Suddenly, Nicholas rushes into the living room, his body still wet. Did you answer my phone without asking? No. Margaret picked up, but I didn't listen. I see. His stern face relaxes suddenly, his brow smooths. Is he cheating? And what was that about out of the picture? That night, unable to shake my suspicions, I wait until Margaret and Nicholas are asleep. Then I check his phone again. The caller ID reads Eric. There are several calls from this Eric, but the voice was unmistakably a woman's. When I open WhatsApp, there's frequent communication with a woman named Caroline. Reading the content, it's clear that Eric is probably a cover, and it's really Caroline. In the messages I found on his phone, there were details about the sinister plan the woman had just mentioned. I was so shocked, I caught my breath. Who is this woman? I can't believe it. Fuming, I clenched my trembling hands tightly. Further investigation of his photo gallery revealed multiple selfies of Caroline cozying up to Nicholas. The woman in these pictures, attached to Nicholas like glue, looked familiar. Is this woman? Could it be? When I checked my work computer, it turns out she was someone I knew. So that's how it is. After transferring all the evidence to my computer, I found some important documents in Nicholas' carry-on bag. If you're up for this, be prepared. I've got plenty to corner you both. I then made a call to someone. I didn't sleep a wink that night, and morning eventually came. As I prepared breakfast, Nicholas, unusually up early and in high spirits, said, "Great weather for a drive, huh?" "Sure is." I replied with a fake smile, but he didn't seem to notice my mood. "All right, let's get moving." After dropping Margaret off at my in-laws' house, Nicholas started driving. Today, Nicholas was unusually chatty, rambling on about trivial matters. As I played along, my phone rang about 30 minutes into the trip. "It's a call from your mom. Margaret seems to have a fever. We need to go back." "What?" "I mean, we asked Mom to watch her. She should handle it. Mom says she has a fever close to 102 degrees Fahrenheit and wants to take her to the hospital. I have the medical insurance card, so we need to go back." "All right, fine." Nicholas reluctantly made a U-turn. When we arrived at my in-laws' house, Nicholas energetically opened the door to be greeted by a surprised-looking Sasha, my MIL. "Mom. How's Margaret's fever?" "What are you talking about?" "You called Sophie's phone earlier, right?" "I did. I never made such a call." Confused, Nicholas and Sasha were at a loss for words, but Nicholas quickly turned to confront me. "Hey! What's going on?" Fully expecting this question, I flashed a big smile and told Nicholas. That was a lie to bring you back here." "What?" "But the phone rang, didn't it?" "That was just an alarm. I set the ringtone and the alarm tone to be the same to make you believe that a call had come in." Just then, we heard, "Daddy, Mommy." And Margaret came running down the hall, hugging Nicholas around his legs. Nicholas glares at me, not even glancing at Margaret. Explain yourself. Oh, just returning the favor for all the lies you've told so far. You kidding me? Are you making a fool out of me? Hearing Nicholas' angry shout, a surprised and crying Margaret hides behind me. Sasha, sensing the mood, takes Margaret's hand and says, "Let's read a book upstairs," leading her to the second floor. Standing alone in the entryway, Nicholas just stares at me in silence for a moment. That's when the doorbell rings. Opening the door, to our surprise, it's Nicholas' affair partner, Caroline. Caroline? What are you doing here? Nicholas seems utterly flustered. What do you mean? You invited me here to meet your friends in PIL, didn't you? I did. Look. Here's the message you sent me. Caroline shows her WhatsApp screen to a puzzled Nicholas. More importantly, why is your wife here? Caroline presses, while Nicholas stammers, lost for words. I was the one who invited Caroline, pretending to be you. Hearing my words, both of them look at me, eyes wide open. What the heck are you thinking? Because I'm not ready to move on to the next world just yet. Nicholas, you were planning something nefarious with me by the sea, weren't you? How do you know about that? Both Nicholas and Caroline seem unsettled, exchanging alarmed glances. They clearly never suspected their plot was exposed. When Margaret answered your phone, I overheard Caroline say, "The plan is on, and my wife will be gone tomorrow." Anybody would find that strange upon hearing it. I move to the living room, sit across the table from the two, and slam printed copies of their WhatsApp conversations and photographs on the table. I have plenty of evidence. How did you get this? Nicholas and Caroline are stunned, staring at the undeniable evidence. Did you forget what I do for a living? You work some desk job at a company. True, but it's a detective agency. These days, I'm doing more sleuthing than clerical work. At that, Nicholas and Caroline tremble in disbelief. And then, I lay out the $300,000 life insurance policy under Nicholas' name in front of him. I can't believe my own husband was planning to trade my life for money. That's a misunderstanding. What misunderstanding? The entire plan is detailed in those WhatsApp messages. Well, you see. Nicholas scrambles for words, trying to make an excuse. I turned to the woman beside me, who was avoiding eye contact, and asked her a question. So, are you pregnant? What? Caroline's eyes darted around as she looked to Nicholas for support. To my surprise, he started defending her. Hey, yeah, she is. She's carrying a baby, so don't give her a hard time. That's not fair. Nicholas walked over to Caroline and affectionately rubbed her belly, giving me a glare. That's a lie. What do you mean, a lie? I'm 5 months along. Caroline pointed to a sonogram picture on the table. Look at this. This is proof. The date on that sonogram is 10 months old. If it was real, the baby would be born by now. What? What do you mean? Nicholas was watching the exchange between me and Caroline with a puzzled expression. The pregnancy is a lie. Also, did you know she's a scam artist? Nicholas looked shocked. Turns out, Caroline was a scam artist who targeted married men. Her scheme was always the same: pretend to be pregnant after dating for a while and then extort a large sum of money. I had been involved in a background check for Caroline through work and recognized her face. When I showed the investigative report to Nicholas, he was reading it, gasping. You're kidding me. Nick, all of this is nonsense. Don't listen to her. A panicked Caroline clung to Nicholas, but he forcefully shook her off and sighed deeply. I can trust Sophie because she's never lied to me. Compared to that, I can't believe you're not just lying, but you're also a scam artist. No, Nick, please believe me. Caroline sank to her knees, covering her face with her hands, and began to sob as if to gain sympathy. However, even Nicholas seemed to realize he could no longer trust Caroline. Out of the blue, he offered me a sincere apology. Sorry. My bad. Let's start over. I was utterly flabbergasted by Nicholas, who seemed to think an apology would fix everything. I then handed him the divorce papers I had prepared in advance. We can't be a married couple anymore. You'll sign this, right? In the divorce proceedings, I also demanded $30,000 in damages, $20,000 for property division, and $1,000 for monthly child support. Please, don't say that. Reconsider. It's too late for that. The only person I love is you, Sophie. Just as Nicholas was resisting, making all sorts of excuses and hesitating to sign, Margaret came downstairs and ran over to him. Dad, do you need help signing? Should Margaret write it for you? Margaret smiled innocently at him. Unable to resist any longer, Nicholas signed the papers without a word. Dad, I signed it well for you. Margaret, who knew nothing of the situation, beamed happily. Sasha noticed the situation and invited Margaret to the park. Full of energy, Margaret said, I'll be going now. And left. I'll also demand $1.5 million from you in the divorce case, I told Caroline. She lost her temper, her face turning red. Why should I have to pay? I'll also be contacting the police about you. Pay for your crime. Caroline's face turned pale, and she started to tremble. I can't be caught now. She dashed out of the living room towards the entrance. However, police were already waiting outside, and Caroline was immediately arrested. Let go of me! Caroline, whose appearance was far from her shrieks, thrashed about as she was restrained by the police. Nicholas, who had followed her to the entrance, looked drained when he saw what was happening. A police officer then tapped Nicholas on the shoulder and said, It's time to go. No way! Why do I have to be arrested? Sophie, help me! Nicholas resisted and struggled, but the burly police officers dragged him into the patrol car and drove off. About 15 minutes later, Sasha and Margaret returned home. Sasha had tears in her eyes and apologized to me, as if she'd seen everything from a distance. Turns out, it was Sasha who called the police. When I found out about Nicholas's plan to ruin me with Caroline, I immediately confided in Sasha. Shocked, Sasha said, If that's true, it's my responsibility as a parent to report this to the police. And she agreed to help. That's why she had been keeping an eye on us while entertaining Margaret upstairs. I guess she took Margaret to the park because she couldn't bear to let her granddaughter see her father get arrested. I said, I'm sorry for causing such a commotion, and handed Sasha a handkerchief. The next day, I filed for divorce in court. Nicholas and Caroline ended up behind bars. Nicholas sold our home and used the money to pay alimony and child support. Sasha covered the remaining costs, saying, It's the least I could do. The plan was to make Nicholas pay her back once he's out of jail. As for the compensation claimed in the divorce case against Caroline, I plan on having her pay in full once she has served her time. Meanwhile, Margaret and I moved back to my parents' house. Margaret is doted on by my parents, who find her incredibly adorable. I am committed to protecting my sweet Margaret and pouring all my love into her from now on.